So if you're watching this video, you're probably considering the idea of quitting your job, and it can be quite hard to decide at which point to grind it out and when it's time to abandon the ship altogether. And in this video, I'll give you my take about the points to consider when deciding to switching your job. Now, over the past year, I've changed my job 3 times, so there are some learnings that I had over this period of time that I will share with you. So stick around and let's get into it. Okay, so number 1 thing to consider when switching your career is the experience. Now, this may sound somewhat obvious, but it's worth restating anyway, because when it comes to experience, inevitably, we're gonna reach the point in our careers where the job will become too repetitive and will plateau in our development. And at that point, we can just continue carrying on and embrace the fact that we're gonna become an expert in certain things, although repetitive, or we can choose to advance further. Another point to consider is that our career objectives can change. So we might start our job with a certain perspective in mind, and that perspective over time can change. So with my experience, for example, I started actually with conservation architecture, which is a completely different approach to design and building buildings. And later on, I considered to switch to a new build. So that would be an example of career objective change. So it's worth mentioning though, whenever you consider these things, a good practice is to talk to your employer first before making a decision, especially if you're quite friendly and close with your colleagues and your team, because there might be options that they can give you to consider. And if there isn't options, sometimes the company just purely have no scope to give you the experience that you need or that learning path and those opportunities to advance to the next level. And at that point, you're leaving on a good term, so it's amicable and there's no hard feelings. And I think that's the best way to leave the job for something else, especially because that means you can come back at some point later if you decide that whatever you're moving to is not what you actually want. The second point is the salary. Again, quite self-explanatory. It's one of the main reasons why people change jobs, because they feel that they're not rewarded appropriately. But I think before you decide to quit your job on the basis of salary, it's important to do a due diligence checks. And if you find that, the difference in salary is only a few grand a year, then it might be worth thinking, is it actually worth switching a job? Because whenever you start a new job, there is that period of time where you have to settle in and you have to get into grips with what's going on. And that process is quite time consuming and intensive. It takes time to get basically trust of the people and get into the groove of things. Obviously, if the salary difference is substantial, then it's worth going and speaking to your employer and asking them for a raise on the basis that you have this counter offer, which is really effective strategy compared to the one where you just go and ask them directly. The other interesting point when it comes to salary is the reframing of this whole question of the salary, from whether I deserve more to a bit more practical perspective, which is that, generally speaking, the salary equates to amount of experience you have and how useful you are. So if you want to get more money, better salary, I think it's worth looking at the question of the salary as, how can I contribute? What sort of experience do I have and how I improve that experience? The salary should, in theory, increase with the experience. The more experience you have, the higher the salary is. The third area to consider when changing your job is the management. Now, what do I mean by management? Well, the management is the resourcing of the staff and its allocation of time and money to certain activities in the project. So whenever you start a project, there is that first initial stage of kind of thinking about how much money we need to charge the client and how much time to allocate per stage of the project and what kind of staff to allocate to those activities. People in senior positions, directors, will go through those tasks, and from their experience and data that they have, they'll put together timesheets and the program for the job. And if the project is properly resourced, in theory it should be running quite smoothly. There might be occasional hiccups, but nothing much. And so the stress level that the people who are working on the process should be quite manageable. It's often the case that it's not like that at all, and that we need to stay overtime and we're overstressed, and there is generally quite a lot more to do than we're accounted for. And when you're early in your career, it's actually a good experience to go through that because it becomes an intensive learning process. But I think in the long term, it's not very sustainable. So it's worth asking yourself if the stress levels that you're going through, are they worth it? Is it your fault that you're not keeping up with the project, or it's somebody else's miscalculations? There's also the flip side of that, and it's being pigeonholed in one certain activity because you're good at that. And so you're stuck in this wheel, this hamster wheel of doing same repetitive repetitive tasks just purely because you're good at them and you're not being challenged enough. So the next point is the career growth. Now, career growth might sound like an old-fashioned term, but I think the core definition is still valid, which is that when you're in any type of organization, you generally want to be leveling up and you want to have a growth and kind of influence over the way the company is running. So rather than always have to report to somebody, everybody should aim for that stage in a firm where you're responsible for other people and you're having a higher stake and higher level of decision making in the company. Now, it doesn't mean you have to become a director necessarily for that to happen, but it's other people kind of trusting you enough that there are those opportunities to have a higher stake in decision making and overseeing the projects. But depending on how the company is run, there might be a glass ceiling, or there might be forces outside of your control that you cannot influence, and there's no clear path to that career growth. And again, what that leads to, if there are no options to grow, you get into the same repetitive pattern and you get stuck in a plateau stage. So if that happens, if you feel that there's no opportunities to grow, it's a really valid point to consider when deciding to switching a job. And in my opinion, one of the most critical things to consider when deciding to switch a job is the general vibe of the place. Now, whenever we apply to a workplace, it's really hard to know how it's going to be like in reality, how the people around us going to be, what the management is like, what the general attitude of people in the office is, and even small things like what the layout of the office is. Is it a nice working environment? All those things might not be super obvious at the interview stage. And whenever you start working for a new company, within a couple of months, you will develop like a gut feeling pretty quickly as to whether you would like to stay in that firm for a long time or not. And I think it's quite important to listen to that gut feeling, because it will tell you if you like the atmosphere of the place or not. And on top of that, another question that's quite useful, I think, to ask yourself is if you envisage yourself staying there for 2 years. Would that be something that you would like to do? Can you see yourself staying in the company for a reasonably long period of time? And if the answer is no, then again, I think it's worthwhile considering alternative options. So I think changing jobs is a risk. You never know for sure whether a new place is going to have the same advantages as your current job, if it's going to be better or worse in certain things. But I think if you have come to a decision to, current place is not suitable for your needs, I think it's much better to jump the boat and see what's on the other side than having the regret and the feeling that you haven't done that. And so the only way to know for sure if the place that you're applying to is worth it is to actually start working in it. I made a custom playlist that I will link up somewhere here that goes through the productivity techniques that I think are fundamental for architects. And so if you enjoyed this video, you might also like these other videos that I'll link up here. Check them out and I'll see you on the other side.